Because I think people, they've heard a lot about insulin and then the byproduct when you have too much insulin, insulin resistance.
Well, hang on. Let's just, if we can just back up there for a moment. So you've just actually raised something that is very commonly thought of in the low-carb community, which I think is wrong. And it's the connection between too much insulin causing insulin resistance. And I know that is cited and by some very credible people in this field, but the more I look into the science of it, it just doesn't make sense. So the notion is that, let's say if you go to a loud concert and you're hearing a lot of noise and you walk out of the concert and your hearing's a bit muffled afterwards. Your hearing's gotten used to the loud noises. It's not that sensitive. The same if you go into a room with a bad smell. And the notion is that insulin is the same. If you just expose yourself to a high level of insulin, the body gets used to that level of insulin. But the evidence actually suggests that that doesn't happen. And without going to the details too much, it actually looks like the problem of insulin resistance happens from too much sugar and too much seed oil in general. So insulin is a chemical that circulates through the blood and it goes to a cell, and that cell has what we call an insulin receptor, which has a particular affinity for insulin. It doesn't want to see any other chemical. The only chemical it wants to see is insulin. And when insulin comes in and joins to that receptor, that triggers a whole downstream cascade of cellular machinery doing stuff, such as saying, oh, let's store fats on and so forth. Now, what happens if we've got that receptor that takes insulin and then we just fill it with chewing gum? Insulin comes along and it can't get in, it can't activate the receptor. Then you have a problem. So the problem of insulin resistance is actually a broken receptor. And when I'm looking at the literature, it's actually fairly clear how the receptor gets broken. So the receptor is actually sitting in a special section of the cell membrane. It's sitting, think of the cell like a ball, and you've got these little areas of cell membrane, they're called lipid rafts, and they're extremely dense in cholesterol. So we know that cell membranes contain a lot of cholesterol, but the lipid raft region actually contains more than 5 times the amount of cholesterol as the surrounding membrane. So these little lakes or rafts of lipid, that's where the insulin receptor sits. And when you consume too much sugar, your liver produces a compound which is toxic to the lipid raft called a ceramide. And when you consume too much seed oil, there's actually a plant form of cholesterol. It's a plant analog of cholesterol. It's close to human cholesterol, which means it can be absorbed by the body in small amounts, but it's different enough that it doesn't work the same. And this too goes to the lipid raft and damages the function. And once this lipid raft is destabilized, then the insulin receptor in the lipid raft can't work. So insulin comes along and it doesn't activate it properly. But here's the problem. We have slightly different types of lipid rafts between muscle tissue, liver tissue, and fat tissue. So guess which tissue doesn't get as affected by these? That's the fat tissue. So you impair the signaling to the liver and the muscle, but the fat tissue can still work. So the fat tissue, insulin's acting on that, and that can still take up all the energy. But the important benefits of your muscles taking up energy to burn, well, that's less efficient. And the liver taking up the sugar to store as glycogen, well, that becomes less efficient, so on and so forth. So this is the real problem of insulin. It's not to do with a chronically high exposure to insulin. It's primarily due to a very high carbohydrate diet, especially sugar diet, because that tells the liver to produce something called a ceramide. You may have heard of this process called de novo lipogenesis. So de novo lipogenesis basically is the liver making fat. And what does it make fat out of? It makes fat out of carbohydrates. And this is what a lot of people can't get their head around. They think, well, if I've got too much body fat, it must be because I'm eating too much fat. In actual fact, the fat that you eat, the body burns very readily. It's very hard for the body to break down fat and then to restore it. It's much easier for the body to actually make fat from carbohydrates. That's the fat that typically gets stored. But it's also, that's the fat that when you produce that fat, it's a particular type of fat. It's called a palmitate that turns into this ceramide chemical called ceramide palmitate, and that damages the lipid raft, and that causes insulin resistance. So that's the actual mechanism of insulin resistance.